before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce Ikigai. Ikigai is a collective of wellness-focused workspaces with 3 locations in Nairobi, specifically Westlands, Lavington, and Lower Kabete. We have a 4th location coming up soon on Riverside, and essentially what we do is we offer individuals, SMEs, startups, creatives, and corporates with beautifully designed and safe workspaces for their teams. Our memberships are designed to be flexible, to promote well-being, and take the hustle out of running an office space. We are also super excited to announce that we've officially reopened. From when the first cases for COVID were announced in Kenya, we took the time to prioritize the safety of our workspaces for current and future members. And after putting in several key health and safety measures, we are thrilled to announce that as of last week, all our spaces are now fully operational, and we're happy to see our members back at work. So for those of you who don't know about Ikigai and would like to know more, please do visit our website. We have a lot of information on different memberships and what we've done in terms of health and safety that you could consider for yourselves and for your teams. Awesome. So on to today's event. At Ikigai and as a startup, we recognize how important a strong and healthy culture can be for a team. We also recognize how a healthy team culture can positively affect the members who share the Ikigai spaces with us. We've also seen how a strong sense of community within the team has helped us navigate the pandemic and to grow closer together even as we returned to the office. So we're hosting today's conversation with HR and culture leaders to help us better navigate team culture during the pandemic and beyond. And we hope that this session provides you and your team with the insights that you need to build and strengthen culture at your workplace. So with that, I will now hand over to Doris, who's the country director at Shortlist, and will be moderating today's conversation and introduce our panelists for today. Great, over to you, Doris.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and it's really, really great to be here. First of all, I think thank you for just Ikigai for bringing this conversation here, because I think it's extremely pertinent as we're going through all that's happening that we actually have this conversation. It's great to see, usually we say it's great to see so many familiar faces, but I'm going to say it's great to see so many people I know. Shout out to Z, Irene Gitau. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us to listen into this conversation. As I think we all know that culture is intrinsically tied to competitive advantage of a company. We know that how our culture is understood, perceived, addressed, actually does give a company a competitive advantage. Sometimes in other studies, up to 3.7 times better business performance if someone has a really, really robust, if a company has a robust culture. But then COVID has happened, and I think what we are seeing is it's either exacerbated really, really good cultures or has completely broken down some of the cultures. So, and I think today what we want to do is just really, I am joined by 2 amazing ladies who will really share their experiences either from a lot of the work they've done around culture or as their own, as business leaders in their own firms, who will take us through what culture means in times of crisis. And feel free to please ask questions. Let's share as much as we can. Again, we are all learning through even the pandemic, even culture. I don't think anybody has cracked culture, for lack of a better word. So let's all feel free to share as we go along. So without further ado, I want to invite, let's start with Alana. Alana, you can introduce yourself and also tell us a bit about why you think this topic is very important to you.
Sure, thanks, Doris. My name is Alana Rush. I am COO at Shortlist, so I have the pleasure of working with Doris on a daily basis, which is an absolute delight. And my background, I started my career as a teacher. So I really started to grapple with this question of what is culture by looking at it in a classroom and in a dorm environment where I was tasked with being a parent to young children, teenagers, in their pivotal years. And that really informed how I think about building culture and what that means is from values for both in the classroom and now in companies. I've then spent most of the rest of my career in the education space, both as a consultant and advisor, and then most recently was working with tech companies, and before I landed at Shortlist, where our purpose is to unlock professional potential and basically play matchmaker between great companies and great people and help them find really great connections together. part of the reason why I think this topic is so important is because there's not one right answer to culture. It really is a question of fit and inclusion and making sure that people find a place where the values align and they can be their best selves. So when you start to unlock this question of what is culture and how do you do it well, and how do you make spaces so that the people that you work with can be at their best, it really is the difference between people being sort of fine at work and people really coming alive. And that's how I think companies grow and people grow. So it's a topic I really care passionately about. And I also think it sits right next to this conversation about inclusion and diversity and building really strong teams, which I know we'll get to chat about soon. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Doris.
Thank you. I really like your point around making spaces for people to be their best. I think not everybody thinks about culture in that way, so I appreciate that. Ann, welcome, and tell us a bit about yourself and why this topic is important to you.
So Ann Kabinga from Connectex. I'm an organization culture specialist and change management specialist. I think, I've come into culture from an education and marketing background. So I'm very curious about the way people behave, what motivates them to do the things that they do every day, and what motivates them to make the decisions that they make. So that's where my curiosity and my interest in culture comes from. And this is the work I've been doing for the last 10 years. So we've had an opportunity to not only learn so many things about culture, but also to really anchor ourselves to our country context and the things that are influencing culture within this region. To answer the question in terms of what culture is, I think the best analogy I've ever heard around what culture is was by Dr. Ghoshal, quite a long time back, when he said culture is about the smell of the place. And the way he put it was that bad culture is like being in a stuffy room. It creates constraint. It makes you feel tired and not able to move. And good culture is like taking a walk in a forest. It's energizing. It just brings out the best in you. And I've really found that to be true in the last 10 years working with organizations to measure culture, to design appropriate culture and so on. And so in my view, the way culture develops and from what I've actually seen is that culture develops as a response to the context that the organization creates. So, and we create our context through our lived purpose, not what we state on boards at the reception in terms of what our vision is, but what our lived purpose is every day. And it's also built on the processes that we put in place and the people that we bring into the organization. All these things actually contribute to what culture you end up with. And the other thing is that I think that great culture is built on a foundation of organizational trust. And the way you build organizational trust is by making sure that there's alignment between what you say that you're going to do. So, what do you state as your intent, whether it's in your vision or in your strategy, how we say we are going to do it, so your brand values and how you articulate them, with whom we said we'll do it, so the people you bring in, and then finally, just what the stakeholder experience becomes. So if you make sure that the decisions you're making in all these 4 areas are aligned, you end up with positive work culture. And when any area is misaligned, then the environment becomes difficult and you end up losing trust from different stakeholders. So that's how I see culture.
Thank you so much, Ann, for that. And before this, Ann was telling us she could talk about culture the whole day, and she's and I don't know whether we'll have a chance to share or in any other way, but Ann has just completed a really comprehensive study on culture, and the report is out, and it not only just has the Kenyan insights, but there's also a possibility to do a comparative study with other countries, especially in times of COVID. So it'd be great for us to dig into that. I think also the flip side of culture, which as a recruiter, I hear a lot of feedback from hiring managers saying that person was not a culture fit. So there's also how culture has been abused from the other end. So for you, and we'll again just start with Alana, what is not culture to you? What are some of the statements and words that have been used but that are not really culture, but we tend to just misuse them because it's probably the easiest word to use sometimes?
Thanks, Doris. I think that's such a good question because it's so easy to think about culture, and you see this with a lot of companies that say, oh, we've gotten feedback that we have a culture problem or things aren't going well, and what's the quick fix? And I think a lot of times, to my days spent in the New York tech scene, about how to answer the question what culture is not, and without calling out any one particular company, but it wasn't uncommon to go into a tech office and you take a look around and there's jars of snacks everywhere, and there's bean bags, and there's, you know, flashy neon signs, and everyone's in matching t-shirts. But those sort of outward symbols don't in and of themselves make a culture. It's very easy to try and sort of paint a Band-Aid over culture by doing these quick, urgent fixes that actually don't show you what's going on underneath, which is that culture is something that you build in every single interaction and every single day. It's the consistency. It's what happens when two people disagree. Your culture really tells you what kind of rules they've agreed to and how they're going to manage a conflict. That's when culture really comes out, and when your values come out. And so I think for, you know, as we think about culture and hiring and fit, it all comes back to really underststanding what your values are and how you live those, and sort of what the social contract that your team effectively agrees to abide by. And sometimes that does tie back to, you know, team t-shirts and mottos and things like that, but they really have to stem from the values, not just be pasted on top of them. To really, I think, you know, Anne, you said it best, when there's alignment, then that's when those things really start to be even more powerful.
Wow, thank you. I've been thinking a lot about the bean bags and wondering what's happening. Are you taking them online? Like, I'm wondering about the bean bags and the remote work. So that's a really good point. And I like your point around stemming the values from that, and not necessarily that being sort of the culture that everybody sees. Thank you so much for that. And for you, what's not culture in your own context?
I think the one that I constantly have to keep talking about is that culture is not about the management of people only. It's partly about the management of people, but it's about other things. It's about how we define success. It's about leadership style. So how we're cascading strategy, how we're leading. It's about the environments that we create, the bean bags and so on. It's about a whole load of other things other than how we manage people. And the other one that we get a lot is that culture is about employee engagement. Once again, employee engagement is one aspect of culture. There is a whole aspect of culture that's around systems that create, that you know, facilitate this context that I was speaking to earlier. And then finally, the one, another very common one is that, yay, someone's here to fix our culture. I can't fix anybody's culture. People have to fix their own cultures by being and living the values that they proclaim to live. So culture can't be fixed by somebody. We all have to contribute to fixing it.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And in fact, I like your point around systems, and I'm hoping we'll go into that in terms of just the hardware and the software of culture. But also just to, again, piggyback on you still, Anne, with the onset of COVID, obviously, most teams have been forced to work from home, and not everybody has been prepared for this. And some were still familiarizing themselves with the remote work. How do you think this has affected, how do you think the sudden shift has affected culture? And what has been affected the most from a cultural perspective?
So I was speaking to you earlier about this, and I think for me the most significant shift is the personal shift, because culture generally happens as a result of the people within the organization and how they're behaving and what's informing that. But one of the things that we noted in our survey was that when we compared the results from past surveys, so we compared our survey results from 2016 to 2019, and then we did a survey during COVID, and we picked a moment when the panic had ended and people were starting to have some sort of semblance of a normal routine. And what we noted was that people have moved from values that are about character and personality and are now articulating values that are about competence and delivery. So what COVID did is that it pushed us so far back against the wall that we were forced to basically think about the best version of ourselves to be able to navigate and survive this period. So we're seeing people articulating values around personal contribution, around changing so that they could grow. So personal contribution is around accountability, creativity, commitment, achievement. Changing to grow is around continuous learning, adaptability, ambition. And then there's a whole new area of humanness that people are articulating as values that are important to them at work. So I think the personal shift for me was the most significant shift, from character and personality and concern about how others see me to competence and delivery, which is more about the value I bring to myself and to others. And, you know, for me, like for any change manager, I mean, this is like the best place to be. COVID has done a job that would probably take a whole long months to be able to create. It has provided us with a real compelling case for personal and organizational change. So that's the first shift I've seen. So we've seen some negative and some positive shifts coming through in the research. On the plus side, organizations have shown their human side, whether by design or not. But you know, they've demonstrated care for people. Working from home has been perceived as care, and then leaders have shown themselves up as vulnerable. So that's been a positive thing. We also see that there's a shift where what we often saw as bureaucracy is now agility, and organizations embracing whole new ways of doing things, completely new ways. I mean, things that you would never have allowed, your manager would never have allowed you to do, he's now allowing you because there's no script. It's completely uncharted territory. So organizations have demonstrated that they are able to accept new ways of doing things. On the downside, there's evidence of people disconnecting from their corporate community. So people are feeling a sense of isolation, a lack of inclusion, confusion, and there's a general decline in organizational health because of job insecurity and the cost reduction that has come out of this. So those are some of the shifts that we are seeing. I think we've also seen a shift where the organization is not really focused on organizational growth, which is a risk, and also an issue around people focusing on thinking about working with others, which is also a risk that we could talk about a little bit more. But those are the shifts that we are generally seeing in culture in current times.
Okay. Yes. I guess, Alana, just adding on to that, and we know that the pandemic has created a moment of truth for a lot of companies, but what could have positioned organizations and leaders to go through this well from a culture perspective? Are there any particular, aspects of culture that they must have had before they went through this well?
I think one of the things that has stood out is, so at Shortlist, we talk to companies all the time that are both growing and shrinking, and we support them on both sides of that journey. And so throughout the pandemic, we've been speaking to our clients, current and past, about how they're navigating this and what's going well and what's been challenging. And then, all of us, I think, have been talking to our friends and our colleagues and our families about how they're processing this. And one thing that has really stood out is that there was, some meme or quote somewhere that I remember seeing early on that was that we're all not working from home. We are working in our homes while we are trying to navigate the greatest global crisis that we've seen, at least in decades, if not our lives. And I think that the reason why that stood out to me is that because the leaders who have navigated this best, or maybe were best positioned or well positioned to handle this, are the ones who lead first with empathy, with vulnerability, and with understanding that people on their teams are whole people who are dealing with an objectively challenging situation in different ways. We even saw this on our leadership team. I remember talking through COVID. This was early March, and we were trying to figure out what it meant and what it meant for our company, and were we going to have to close offices and shut down travel, and how is it going to impact our business? And there were three of us on our having these series of conversations, and each one of the three of us accepted the change that was happening at different paces. It impacted us differently. There was, one of the team members was like, COVID's not a thing. it's not really an issue. It's going to go away in a week. Don't worry about it. I was probably on the other end of the spectrum where I was like, guys, nobody's ever coming back to the office. Like, start emergency planning now. And then there was someone sort of in the middle. But the point is that, you know, the key is acknowledging that, like, you have real humans who are dealing with things both in and outside of your control. And I think companies that have been able to sort of approach things with a whole person attitude have emerged the best. I know at Shortlist, we looked at Airbnb when they were going through layoffs, and the compassion that their CEO showed when he was effectively downsizing a huge percentage of his company, but approached that process with transparency, with empathy, by giving support in as much as they possibly could. And if you haven't read the letter that the CEO of Airbnb wrote to his employees, Google it after this. It's really quite spectacular. So I think that companies that had leaders who were leading first with empathy, looking out for the well-being of their whole teams, were really positioned to just acknowledge that this is a really unprecedented situation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And absolutely, as you were speaking, I was trying to imagine between where I was between the spectrum of getting extremely shocked and thinking that Corona is not live. I shall not answer that for today. But I think right now what I'd like us to do is maybe answer a few questions. So Miriam Kimani has asked a question around, and I think I'll give this to Alana. While recruiting, what are your thoughts on culture fit and culture add? Should we hire people who fit and conform to our culture, or add to it? Is culture fixed?
I love that question. So thank you for asking, Miriam. I think it's just so great. And it's one that we get quite a lot. We actually published an ebook recently about culture, and initially it was about culture fit. And during the writing process, we adjusted it to really include culture additions and how do you actually expand your culture and grow it. When we look at this, it still comes back to fundamental values, right? Like, you have to have alignment on the core matters first and foremost. And then, yes, it's absolutely vital and important to bring people into the table who bring different things in. One of the first companies that I worked for was a consulting firm, and the tagline for the firm was smart, nice, driven. So simple. Smart, nice, driven. And, you know, there are all these jokes and conversations among the employees, about 200 of us globally, about, are you more smart? Are you more nice? Are you more driven? But everybody shared these three things. We just didn't have mean people. And it was a really serious screening criteria when people came in. Now, that being said, beyond smart, nice, and driven, we had people from different religious backgrounds and different races and different ethnic groups and different political backgrounds. And we really believed in building diverse teams because diverse teams have different perspectives and bring different thoughts together. And we were consulting, so that got us to better answers and better outcomes. So I think the answer is that you have to have both. You have to sort of align on the basics and make sure that people, you know, different people value different things, that you have people who sort of fundamentally align. But then beyond that, yes, absolutely seek out the people who challenge you, who think about things in a different way, who've been exposed to different experiences, and who will help you iterate in a way that gets you and your business and your team to a much better place.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I completely agree. It's great to be able to think about how you integrate people in your business who help you shift your culture to where you want it to go. So I agree with Alana. Those are the things that you need to do.
Okay. So there's another question from Yogda Bakari. So let me just try and, I don't know whether you can use the same question. I think good questions. We all assume that people, new recruits, employees know their values are. I have found that not enough of us in the workforce know how to define our values. Therefore, how are we supposed to know whether our values align with the company? Can we do more work on recruitment level or pre-recruitment level to encourage people to understand what their own values are? It's a really interesting question. And do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I think so. Two levels. Yes, it's true. We have also experienced that a lot of people haven't spent enough time thinking about their values or how those values show up in their daily lives. So I think that, and this speaks to one of the other points that I think would have, that is important for organizations to start to think about, which is developing people as a whole person, so that when they come into the organization has the responsibility, not just at recruiting, but throughout that employee's life cycle within the organization, to constantly work with employees in terms of defining and renewing their values so that they not only fit their career progression, but also fits where the organization is trying to go.
Okay. Sorry, muted. So it's interesting that both Alana and yourself are speaking a lot about bringing the whole person to work. And I think that sort of segues really well into what, for a lack of a better word, the creators of culture in a business. And so we know that culture and leadership are really fundamentally intertwined, and leaders have a critical role in defining culture in organizations, and especially at this time. So what do you think leaders could do better at this time to just make sure that the culture that they've ever built or one that they're trying to create is able to ride the pandemic?
I think that, there are several things that we have learned or seen during this time. And some of the things that really stood out for me when I looked at the survey was around self-management, leaders' ability, I think Alana alluded to it, their ability to handle stress. When this happened, a lot of people spoke about the fact that their leader panicked, and so that doesn't have a great effect on your employee population when you panic or show panic. And so handling stress, but also acting with courage, being vulnerable and making decisions. So that whole area of self-management for leaders, that would really have helped us navigate this time well. The other thing is around inclusion, remembering that even as a leader, you're not alone. The organization is made up of many different people and they all bring something to the table. So just being able to include a lot more people within your organization in terms of just coming up with solutions to the issues that they are facing. And I think one of the things to say is that this survey does show that we now have a much more resourceful workforce. So it's really going to be a leadership imperative to include your people in sort of coming up with the solutions that you need to move forward and to forge the way forward into the next your next level. So inclusion is important. Another one was around visibility, just making sure that you understand that it is by modeling the change that you want to see or modeling the behavior that is required, that is going to enable your people to move along with you. Now we say leadership is culture is a shadow of the leader. So whatever the leader does has a huge impact on how he moves, has a huge impact on what the culture starts to become. And then finally, the other one is on leadership communication. So we've seen a lot of communication, and what our study tells us is that during this period, there's been a lot of focus on process. So a very inward-looking approach, looking into the organization in terms of how can we be able to build up our capacity to deliver, which is, understood. But it's really important that we don't lose focus on communicating on not just the processes and how those are changing, but on purpose as well, and on people and the things that are important for us for people. So frequent communication, but whole communication on purpose, on people, on process, coming from leadership would also have really been important. So those are the things that we see as having been important. When we asked people what they would like to see in future leaders, the things that they spoke about were courage, what came out on top. We just want to see a lot more courageous leaders who are making decisions quickly and who are acting with courage. There's a book called The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek, and I think he articulates this really, really well. So courageous leadership, leading from the front, humanness, being able to show your vulnerability, inclusiveness, being entrepreneurial, embracing new ideas, which is something that has shown up a lot, and just a whole sense of integrity and accountability alongside that to be able to lead through or navigate these challenging times. So those are the things that I would list as important for leaders in the future, for them to be able to not only get their organizations out of the current situation there is, which is almost a transition situation and into a new level or the next level.
Okay. Just to go back to you, Anne, again, and I think so you've talked about the ability to self-manage, how they include others in their decision-making, the kind of sort of behaviors that they're modeling, and also their communication. But you also touched on something that I think is very interesting, which is just the vulnerability, which I'm sure links to just how adaptable you are. And knowing our context, especially from an African culture, from a very masculinistic society, I have seen a lot of feedback and a lot of people just talking about the way it's hard for them to say they don't know. They would rather guess the answer. What would you advise leaders who are struggling with just being able to say, I don't know the answer, and when I know, I will let you know?
Well, I think, I just saw a poll this morning where most of the people said most leaders said they're not prepared to share their emotions. And I think, this is an area of development. This is an area where people need to actually seek help, because showing vulnerability is a really important leadership trait. It really helps people not only connect to you as another human being, but also to feel a lot more confident to be able to try new things and not be fearful. So yes, I agree that we do have a leadership issue, but I think that one of the things that you'll see that we recommend and the areas of work that we feel is really important based on what we've seen in our study is the way we develop our leaders. We need to think a bit more about how we develop leaders, once again, as whole people, as opposed to just based on specific competencies.
Okay, thank you for that. Another thing that you mentioned that I'd like Alana to sort of touch on a bit, and I know this is something very, very close to her heart, is diversity and inclusion. So we know, and it's been done, we all know there's a business case to diversity. It is important that we actually include, we are diverse, and then we also include people in the kind of decision makings that we're making. And over the last month, I think that has even become even more pertinent globally. But I guess, Alana, my question for you is, how can organizations position diversity and inclusion at the core of their company culture, if that's something that they'd like to do?
I think it's a great question, and it's so relevant now at this moment globally. And I'm mostly American, so it's a really relevant question for the United States right now. But I think across the board, this question of how do you build diversity and how do you build inclusive environments, I think it actually requires you to take a step back a couple levels. And I think about, like, what is the purpose of companies? Well, effectively, people are working together to build something that is better than what they started with, right? And you want companies to be successful. We're all sort of working towards, like Anne mentioned, this focus on purpose. And to do that, you have to have teams that will be better. And in order for this idea of diversity, bringing different people together to get to a solution in a better way, and inclusion, making the people who are part of that team feel like they're included and like they can be their full selves at work without having to feel like they need to be a different version of themselves or that they're not welcome or accepted. You need to actually believe that that will lead to a better outcome. And that is where I think that, there's sometimes a disconnect. I think the companies where they have a lot of showy statements about diversity, but then you look at their boards and it's a bunch of old white dudes. Those are the companies where it's clear that there's not actually the belief that bringing different people to the table will make things better. So I think that's a hard question to ask and answer. And I can't recall the name of the gentleman who did this, but it was a really interesting example of a guy who actually stepped down from his seat on his company's board because he said, as long as I'm in this seat, somebody else who doesn't look like me isn't. And I think that was to me, one of those situations where that's a really higher level way of thinking about how do you not only build inclusion, but build a seat at the table. So I think it's a little bit of a higher level answer to your question, maybe getting a little bit more tactical. I think a really good question to ask is, when I look around my company and I think about the people who might feel like, first of all, who feels like an other? Is there a woman on our tech team who's surrounded by guys? Is there somebody who's from a different religious background or racial background, or somebody who's maybe just junior on a team of really senior people? What is it that makes someone an other? And what can I do to make them feel comfortable and like they can actually speak up? I think like thinking in that way is really one of the basics. Another way to think about it, I had a great professor in business school who taught a course about power from the perspective of those who lack power. And he said, you as future business leaders will go out into the world and you will be in positions where you're managing teams, or you're a parent and you have more power than your children. And if you can think about giving somebody who has less power than you a piece of your power, whether that's inviting them to speak or asking a question or saying, hey, Doris, I haven't heard from you in a while in this meeting. Why don't you tell me what you think? That's how you slowly start to shift the balance and help to make people feel more included in an environment day to day.
Okay, and I don't know whether you want to add anything to it. I really like how you've been able to understand it, help us understand from the larger scale, but also just the day-to-day actions that we can take. And what I hear from you a lot is more inclusion, and probably not less diversity, but really more inclusion into a lot of the business. So it's one thing to bring people in of diverse cultures, but it's another to actually include them into the day-to-day of the organization. And do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so I really like to take an expanded view of diversity and inclusion, and it's true that it's a very topical issue right now, but we really do, we spend a lot of time talking about demographic diversity, what is the age of people, what's the gender of people, but I think there's a lot more that's happening within our local context that we need to think about. And so, we need to think about experiential diversity, for example. You're constantly seeing recruitment ads listing the number of degrees people must have, almost narrowing it down to the school you must have gone to, and so on. So, we really need to open ourselves up to thinking about people who've had experiences that are different from us, and also cognitive diversity, the acceptance of people who don't think like us, who have different ideas of life and different views of life. So for me, an expanded view of diversity is really, really important, beyond counting how many women you have in your organization and so on. But I think diversity, ticking the diversity box might be easy. The one I think that people find very, very hard is the inclusion dimension of it, which is very much linked to equity and also our cultural context. But in our work, one of our biggest things is that every single person's voice must be heard. So how do we create a system and a structure where we're hearing everybody's voice all the time? And so it requires us to not only put ourselves in the shoes of those people, but be prepared to invest in the development of people throughout the organization, so that, this particular period has showed us up in that particular area where, the sales and marketing team have fantastic laptops and all that stuff, but the rest of the organization doesn't. So how, they can't work from home because they don't have those facilities. So inclusion requires us to put ourselves in the shoes of every single person, but also to constantly seek out their voice so that we are hearing what their perspective is. Where does this organization look like from where you stand? And giving those people an equal voice. So that's a very important part of our work, because individuals make up organizations. Organizations cannot transform unless individuals transform. And it's not about just leadership transformation, it's every single human being within your organization. And that's why we say if we have better people, we'll have better organizations, and we will have a better society, because the person who comes to work in the morning is the same person who goes home in the evening. So they learn good habits at work, they take them home. And that's why culture for us, organization culture, is so important. It's about creating people who, whose voices we are hearing all the time, who are able to speak up, who are developed so that they're able and equipped to participate in the running of their organization.
Okay, I hear you, Anne. And in defense of all salespeople, we would like to say that we needed the laptops. We had lost our identity. There was no sales. We needed something to ride the wave with. So here for all of them. I think the next one that I'd like us to sort of talk about before we wrap up with post-COVID is someone has asked a question. Let me just find it again. And this is going to Alana because I think it segues into the next question really well. Around the fact that we are going to be working, this is AS, given that we're going to be working remotely from home, and in the long term, we need new rituals and routines to be set. How do you suggest building culture and strengthening culture as people won't be spending a lot of time together? So Alana, I'd like you to answer that, and then also just also help us a bit with thinking about how technology can help with a lot of the cultural changes and shifts.
Great, thanks, Doris. This is actually one of my favorite topics and questions. As the way to use technology to facilitate building culture, I actually think has been one of the best things to come out of COVID. And I'll give you a couple of examples of things that I've loved that our team has done, and then sort of tie the pieces together a little bit. So we have a team, our leadership team is about 13 or 14 people, and we meet regularly. And I don't know that I've ever been part of a leadership team that has more introverts. Really wonderful, powerful leaders, but tons of introverts, right? And so we have these team meetings, and what we found is that now with the way that we think about interacting with each other is not just sitting around a boardroom talking and taking turns filling the space with our voices, but we've actually started to try and think outside of the box about how do we use technology, and what I mean by that is Slack, Zoom, WhatsApp, Google Docs, the chat function in Zoom, to add to our conversations. So now, instead of a meeting where we all just come into a room and somebody talks and everybody else sort of writes their notes, our meetings look something like this. We will have a topic and someone might say, hey guys, here's the question. Now I want everybody to take 2 minutes to think on your own and write down your own response. Now I'm going to open up a Google Doc and invite everybody to copy and paste your answers in. Now spend another 30 seconds looking at what everybody else wrote. So now within about 5 minutes, every single person has had a voice without having to spend 25 minutes going around and each person spending 2 minutes sharing their little piece. So we've been used technology to actually add to the way that we have conversations. That's, to Ann's point, brought a lot more voices to the table in a way that has actually been, I think, more natural to the way that people work and think. And it's not infrequent to have somebody in one of our meetings say, hey guys, I've got a quick question, throw your answers into the chat function. I think the chat function on this is turned off, otherwise I was gonna ask you to actually do this live with us and see how easy it is. But trust me, if you're in a Zoom meeting, just say, hey guys, quick poll, scale of 1 to 5, what do you guys think about this answer? And people will become more engaged and sort of participate in a different way. The second example is that, the idea of how do you build culture? I think when I think about what I miss about an office, it's the informal interactions, running into somebody when you're grabbing a glass of water, when you're eating lunch and finding out about how their day is going and learning about what somebody's been up to over the weekend and getting to know people better. We've really leaned into using Slack and WhatsApp to have like asynchronous deep conversations. And it is the easiest thing, but I guarantee if you start doing this on your team, you'll really start to pull people together. And all it takes is not every night, but every sort of probably 2 or 3 nights a week, somebody will throw a question on our global, we use WhatsApp, but you could easily use Slack or any sort of group communication, throw a question on the channel, and then everybody sort of answers it on their own time. And Ann, you were making a point earlier, and I think somebody asked about vulnerability and how you build this. The questions are sometimes lighthearted, but often they're actually quite meaningful. And early on, we asked a question about what's one object that you have that's meaningful to you, that could fit in a backpack that you sort of bring with you wherever you go. And the first person who answered it answered with a really meaningful story about something that was valuable to them. And the next person, instead of making fun of it or dismissing it, answered with sharing about a gift that her father had given her before he passed away. And then the next person brought an equally valuable thing to the table. And this is all happening. It's not a meeting that's being held. It's not a group. It's not a happy hour over Zoom. It's literally just happening 30 seconds here or there. But before you know it, we started to know a lot more about one another as a team. So I think it's thinking outside the box to really figure out how you can find moments of vulnerability and shared experience that'll help you get to know people better. One question that this is my like little hack or takeaway tip: if you want to get to know your teammates better, ask them where their names came from. It's a very simple question. You probably don't know this about most people, but it's a very easy way to understand a little bit about their family and their history and their culture and their own story. And if you just sort of throw that in your Slack group and make sure somebody's willing to answer first, like I always get a friend in your corner to offer up an answer so that people see that they can start. But I think it really comes down to just building little ways to interact that replicate the sort of magic of being in person together in a meaningful way.
Okay, thank you so much, Alana. You've given us so much nuggets. I hope everybody has taken as much of those toolkits as possible. Yes, and so I really like your point around just creating moments of vulnerability. And I hadn't thought about it, but you're absolutely right. This has actually given the quieter extroverts a chance to really, really probably engage much more than they would on a typical day. So it's almost a flip side of what's positive about what has happened. In the interest of time, I know we don't have a lot of time, but and I'd like us to go a bit into, I don't want the next normal, for lack of a better word. So in terms of moving forward from COVID and what's going to happen next, as we know, creating strong, healthy workplace cultures will involve the effort of everybody in the organization. But what are we going to see when we go back to work?
We're going to see a lot more pragmatic people, people who are coming in with a real desire to contribute, to help the organization move to the next level. I think we're also going to see a lot of fearful people. So it's important to acknowledge that this has caused people to be afraid of so many things, of not just their health and losing their life. A lot of us have been faced with our own mortality, but who are also been faced with, I might lose my job and so on. So there's a lot of fear that needs to be, so we have quite a fragile workforce and a demand for inclusion because, nobody liked that place where they didn't know what was going on and they, lived every minute not quite sure what's happening with customers or what's happening to the business, or will we go back to work? When will we go back to work? So we'll see quite a fragile workforce when we get back. And I think for me, what I think is that a lot of us are living in a COVID box. Speaking to a lot of people, it's almost like COVID's never gonna go away. It's like this is our new normal. The fact is, it isn't. We are not at our destination yet. We're in transition, and I think it's really important for organizations to acknowledge that and to build for the future that they desire to see for their organizations. Having learned the things that we've learned, keeping the things that we are doing now that are making our organizations a much better place. So the adaptability, the agility, the inclusion, the care, the balance, keeping all those things, but understanding that we need to build for the future that we want to see as our next level. So that's the first thing. So pause, reflect. What is the future that you want to see? Let's start there. And you know, I have a call to anybody who's in HR or who's a head of department who wants to start to build initiatives based on this context. And I'm just saying, please don't, because you will soon have to have a different strategy. And that's the reason why we did the study, so that we could take the guesswork out of it and say, actually, these are the things you need to work on as you prepare for your next level. There's a need for reconciliation. There are a lot of hurt people out there who felt that their organizations and their leaders did not step up for them. So we need to think about how we can have that dialogue to be able to get people back. So I would say pause and reflect, reconnect to your purpose and the reason why your organization exists and the things that you want to achieve. Then reconnect to your corporate brand community, your customers, your employees, your stakeholders, everybody who is in your corporate community. Reconnect with them because we've lost that connection. And then engage, you know, start the dialogue to not only reconcile your people, but also to reset them towards the new picture of success, and then to redirect them so that they're able to make steps towards this new future. Mm-hmm. I think that for me is those are the things that we can do in order to move our organizations to the next level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you, man. A lot of nuggets there around need for reconciliation, thinking about dialogue, pause, reconnect to purpose. And I really like the COVID box. I'm going to use that. It is true that we are all thinking like this will never end. And so I really appreciate that. I think the last question, and Alana, just again, riding off from Ann and the post-COVID world, as companies are cautiously starting to hire, there are differences in skills. Are there differences in skills and competencies that you have seen, or do you think companies should be looking for from a cultural perspective?
I think one of the things that we've noticed is that companies are increasingly open to the idea of remote work. And so I think what we will see globally is that teams will start to, not necessarily in every company, but there will be more in examples of teams that actually exist across borders or in different cities in a very different way than we've seen before. I think the impact of everybody working in different places and being hired in different places is that all of a sudden things that seemed impossible 3 months ago are very possible. So effectively, the global workforce just proved that almost not any job, but many desk jobs can actually be done remotely. So I think we'll see a greater shift. And then I also think, you know, just the idea of we've all sort of been through crises together really drives home the point that you want somebody sitting at the table who you can weather a storm with. So I do think that there will be a greater focus on bringing in the right people as companies start to grow again.
Thank you so much for that. I think I'll take a few more questions just from the question and answer section. And I think Sunny Ian has an interesting question. And either of you can answer this. It says, I think this point about leadership and shareholders, and not only internalizing why diversity and inclusion is important, is great. What do you think it will take for HR leaders to affect change effectively in creating more just and inclusive workplace policies in the face of COVID?
Can I jump in with a quick answer?
Yes, go ahead.
So I think that HR professionals are positioned incredibly well to champion the idea of equity. And one way that I think often goes under the radar when you think about diversity and inclusion is actually pay equity. If you're an HR leader, you're one of the only people at your organization who knows how much everybody makes across different functions. And one of the things that we know happens is that the people who negotiate for higher wages or higher pay are not always the ones who deserve those difference in those raises or higher pay. And then what happens is that over time, and typically it's the bravado dudes end up miles ahead of women and people from underrepresented backgrounds in terms of pay. So if you're in an HR seat and you haven't done an audit of do people who do the same job make the same amount of money, that's a great place to start. You can look at that, and if there's differences of over 10% within a particular, like the way to think about it is a is the person doing the job, the same job as the person sitting next to them, or are they being paid differently? If it's off by over 10%, then you should start to say, hey, maybe we need to level this out. And typically when you do that, you'll uncover things like, oh, looks like the dudes in our company make more than the women for doing the same jobs. Like, hey, that's something that the woman sitting in the desk is never going to know because she doesn't know how much the guy sitting next to her makes, but you can help to sort of start to bridge that gap. So pay equity is one of the things I'm most passionate about because it goes so unnoticed, but it can make such a huge difference for everyone in your company.
Thank you so much. And I don't know whether you have anything else to add on that, or would you like to just speak maybe one final question quickly from the box, if you wish? Okay, so I think there are so many questions, and thank you so much, Alana, for sharing the Ann's report. I think she's put it on the chat there, and anybody can access it. Before I hand over to Lisa, I guess for each of us, I'd like to just hear from everybody what have been your takeaways from this session. So if you could just quickly type in. I'm trying to use Alana's method of collaboration to just type in what has been your biggest learning in the question and answer. It'd be great to see what you've come out with this. And then I'll just give Alana and Ann just one final word in terms of just what would be your, if someone is to get one thing from the culture and COVID at this point, what would it be in summary?
A renewed focus on values and purpose.
Renewed focus on values and purpose. And Ann, for you?
I'll keep saying it's a need for whole inclusion and whole, bringing everybody, the organization, bringing all your employees back to the organization as whole people.
So bringing everybody back as whole people. Thank you very much. I don't really have anything else. Lisa, you can take over from here. Thank you for everybody who's put in your comments and really asked a lot of questions. I hope you have learned as much as I have from Ann and Alana. And thank you, Ann and Alana, for just sharing your experiences, your thoughts with us. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Doris. I have nothing else to add to this. I'm so grateful for all of you. Thank you for moderating the session so well, and to our expert speakers for today. And with that, I think we can end today's session. Thank you so much for joining. We hope to see you guys at some other event that we have coming up.